Our keynote speaker this morning is Ron Hendel, and since he is very much been announced already at various points in this session, you don't need any further introduction.
Hey gang, it's much too early in the morning, so if I start talking about basketball, pull me back in. So first of all, let me, what am I doing first of all? Basketball. Boy, the Pacers beat the Heat the other night. Oh, never mind. Keep on topic. So the Exodus is cultural memory. So this has been a lot of fun for me, this conference, because this is the sort of thing that I've been doing with part of my time over the last dozen years or so. I want to recommend a couple of books to you, since people have been putting bibliography up. Jan Assmann's book on Kulturell Gedächtnis, den frühen Hochkultur, is now available in English, and it's really a fantastic, fantastic book. He's the one that brought this kind of methodology into the study of the ancient Near East, and to my mind, this kind of methodology is tremendously fruitful for the kinds of evidence that we have, the kind of texts that we have, the kinds of historical and cultural things that are going on with our stuff. So I'm very excited by it, and I'm really delighted to see that some other people are getting excited about it too. I also want to mention my book that has some essays that were initially inspired by Assmann's work, trying to bring this stuff to the Hebrew Bible. It's called Remembering Abraham, Culture, Memory, and History in the Hebrew Bible. And I just want to say this book has had zero impact in our field. Really. It went immediately into remainder. So, I mean, I'm just delighted to see that some other people are warming up to these sorts of topics, because I really think that it's a very productive way to combine many of the things that biblical scholars traditionally do, but combine them in a way that really brings them together in really a kind of interdisciplinary way and allows us to construct more sophisticated categories of interpretation and construct, I think, more sophisticated theories and proposals and models for understanding the texts and the history of the stuff that we're concerned with. Now, in my attempts to develop this kind of approach to our materials, in my view, I sort of divide the method into three different subsets. One of them goes along the lines of what Jan Assmann calls mnemohistory, and that is to say, looking at the history of how cultural memories form, the interplay of historical events, of literary patterns, of inversions, of condensation of symbols and so forth, the sorts of processes by which cultural memory transforms the past into cultural memory, which is to say in narrative form and ritual form. Yeah, cultural memory, just in short, cultural memory is the past represented in a way that it has current relevance. It's really kind of it's kind of like a perfect verbal form. It's the past with present relevance for a particular social group. Okay? Every social group has a construction of the past, a representation of the past that it remembers, and that memory itself serves to constitute the ethnic, cultural identity of any given group. Okay? And this goes back to Avi Faust's, some of the things that he was talking about yesterday, and I would argue that the narratives of collective memory are really a very essential way by which a group constitutes its ethnic identity. Okay? So the history of the memory and the way it serves to constitute communities is a really central aspect of the study of cultural memory, the study of mnemohistory, and it's clearly an approach that illuminates the Exodus, I submit. Let me read something from Anthony Smith, who works on nationalism and has a beautiful book called The Ethnic Origins of Nations, where he talks about ethnic formations in antiquity, including the ancient Near East. Anthony Smith says, quote, "The sine qua non of ethnicity, the key element of that complex of meanings which underlie the sense of ethnic ties and the sentiments for the participants, are the myths of origins and descent." Okay? This is the sine qua non of ethnicity. I'm saying this because archaeologists talk about material culture, which I assume is important. I know nothing about material culture. But the stories are also crucially important for the construction of identity. Ethnic myths combine, this is still Smith, ethnic myths combine cognitive maps of the community's history and situation with poetic metaphors of its sense of dignity and identity. The fused and elaborated myths provide an overall framework of meaning for the ethnic community, a mythomoteur. He makes it French to make it sound more impressive. A mythomoteur which makes sense of the experiences and defines its essence. Without a mythomoteur, a group cannot define itself to others or to itself, and it cannot inspire or guide collective action. End quote. So my thesis, which is kind of obvious, is that the Exodus myth functions as a mythomoteur for the ethnic self-consciousness and the construction of ethnic identity for ancient Israel. Okay? Now let me say that there's gaps in the evidence that I can't overcome, but this is a model for understanding the function of this story as a collective memory. So I'm arguing, and this is speculative of course, but I'm arguing that the story of the Exodus serves as a mythomoteur for early Israelite identity. That is to say, for the initial crystallization of an ethnos and a polity of Israel, in precisely the same way that it continues to function as a mythomoteur for Jewish identity in the Passover Seder, right? The idea that everyone is as if he or she themselves were at the Exodus, and this is what constructs and reconstructs and revitalizes and reactualizes that collective memory. My proposal is that that function goes all the way back, that this is a story that was part of the process of creating and crystallizing an ethnos, a polity, with a collective self-identity all the way back to the Iron One period. Now, let me make a couple of other remarks of things that I won't have time to go into. To my mind, there's other aspects of the study of collective memory, one of which I call the poetics of memory. And this is looking at how the texts themselves mobilize collective memory and, in fact, foreground and thematize the concept of collective memory in the very act of telling the story. Now, let me say the Exodus is also an excellent example of that, because in the text of Exodus, there is a poetics of memory in various places where the narrator, or occasionally God, or sometimes Moses, steps back and says, I'm telling you this story so that you will remember it, so that you will tell it to your children and your children's children. Okay, now I have to read you one of these passages that I like so much. So this is the poetics of memory, which is complementary to mnemohistory. Let me read you this one. This is my favorite. Vayomer Yahweh el Moshe, bo el Paro, ki ani hichbadeti et libo ve'et lev avadav lama'an. So God says, go to Pharaoh, because I hardened his heart and the heart of all of his servants, in order that, and here's a wonderful purpose clause, and there's a series of purpose clauses, lama'an. Lama'an shiti ototai ele bekirbo, in order to put my signs in his midst, and lama'an tisaper be'ozne vincha uven vincha Et asher hitalalti b'mitzrayim, ve'et ototai asher samti vam. I hardened his heart in order that you will tell the story in the ears of your sons and your sons' sons about how I made a mockery of Egypt and about the signs that I set in their midst. So here's Yahweh saying, well, this is the meaning of the story. This is why I've hardened Pharaoh's heart. This is why I've set all these signs in his midst, so that you will tell this to your children and your children's children. This is right in the middle of the action. It's a beautiful, it's almost like a Shakespearean soliloquy saying, by the way, life is a stage and a play and all the people are players in it. Here Yahweh is saying, this is all happening in order to make a good story that will then be memorable and powerful, and that you will tell your children and your children's children. So the story is in this rhetoric of memory, or this poetics of memory, the story itself is setting itself up as something that will be remembered, will be performed. And this image of telling your children and children's children already conjures up the ritual circumstance of the Passover, the ritual commemorative ceremony in which this story will be reactualized. Okay, so there's lots of places in the Exodus story where this poetics of memory is functioning very strongly. It's foregrounded in the story itself. So the story is conscious of itself as a cultural memory. And the process of cultural memory is part of the poetics of the story. Okay, I want to return to Nemo history because this is what is of more interest to most of you, since you're historians and archaeologists and stuff. So I want to talk about the past a little bit. I want to talk about the past that I would argue conditions the memory, or in some ways is the historical event that the memory is in some way reconfiguring, recalibrating. Aspects of the story are specifically forgotten. Aspects of the story are strategically forgotten. Aspects of the story are kind of, what do I want to say, displaced into other spatial domains. But I think there is arguably historical stuff that is animating the power of this memory, the fact that this memory had a purchase on the people of early Israel. Let me say this another way. The question I want to ask, if we grant this idea that the archaeologists have told us very compellingly that Israel was a more or less indigenous society, even if it was, Shasu in it and Apiru, these are all Canaanites. These are people who didn't come out of Egypt. Okay? So why would the majority of the people in early Israel accept a story, embrace a story as their own story of having come out of Egypt? This is the title of our conference. So why would they embrace a story as our story as having come out of Egypt? So I want to argue that there are historical memories that pertain to the majority of the early Israelite people that made it possible for them to embrace this memory as our memory, as their memory. And that is the fact that for the previous several centuries, everybody in Canaan was a slave to Pharaoh. That's it. It's not a complicated idea. Everybody in Canaan was a slave to Pharaoh for hundreds of years, and the demise of the Egyptian empire in Canaan is precisely contemporary with the rise of this highland polity called Israel. So these are events that are connected. I mean, they're connected sociologically. Israel is one of these polities that pops up in the wake of the collapse of the late Bronze Age regional system. But this part of the regional system that was there was the heavy hand of Pharaoh. Okay? So, this is why they could accept the story, because they all had memories of being slaves to Pharaoh. So this is a lovely picture of a Canaanite captive. I saw this last month in the Met in New York. It's really a beautiful thing. So there's a Canaanite captive. If you see on the right, there's a big platform on his back. And according to the little description, Pharaoh may or may not have been standing on this platform on the back of the Canaanite captive. So this is an encapsulation of the representation of Canaan, at least that we have in the Met, okay? But this is the representation, this is the ideology. Again, history and ideology are connected, but I'm mostly looking at the ideology and its relationship to history. So the picture here is of Pharaoh standing on the backs of Canaan, of Canaanite captives. Is this a Canaanite captive in Egypt? Could be. We know that there were tens of thousands, or at least the Egyptologists tell us, according to the royal inscriptions, there's claims, and it's probably true, of tens of thousands of Canaanite captives in Egypt. But still, that leaves the majority of Canaanites in Canaan, where still they were depicted as captives of Pharaoh. Okay, here's an example of Canaanite captives in Egypt. So my point is, historically, there were two ways of being a Canaanite slave to Pharaoh in the Late Bronze Age. One was to be a Canaanite slave taken into Egypt. So here's an example, Papyrus Harris, this is Ramses III, and this is actually a description of Shasu. I brought them back in great numbers, those my sword has spared, with their hands tied behind their backs before my horses, and their wives and children in tens of thousands. Now, he's probably exaggerating, but still, lots of people. And their livestock in hundreds of thousands. Okay, he's exaggerating. I have imprisoned their leaders in fortresses bearing my name, and I have added to them chief archer and tribal chiefs, branded and enslaved. So these people are branded with the name of Ramses III or something. They're enslaved, tattooed with my name, and their wives and children treated in the same way. So this is just one example of hundreds of examples of pharaohs making either annual or certainly at the beginning of their reign, they make incursions into the Canaanite territories, and for the sake of their own prestige, they have to have a military victory over Canaan, and they bring back many Canaanite captives to work in the temples, to work in the land, also to work in administration. There's a nice quote I have here somewhere by Antonio Loprieno, who talks about how the middle management administrators that you see in the Middle Kingdom in Egypt, in the Late Kingdom, those jobs are filled by foreign slaves from Canaan, foreign slaves from Nubia. And this is because this was to enable the normal workers to be in the military. Okay? So the big military complex. And so Egypt becomes an economy that's based on slave labor in order to sustain that big military. So there's many, Thomas and Jan can correct me, but plausible to say tens of thousands of foreign slaves that the Egyptian economy is based upon. So that's one way of being a slave in Canaan. Oh, here's a nice picture of Seti the First. I think Jim Hoffmeyer showed a clearer slide of this the other day. This is Seti the First bringing Shasu captives into Egypt. And notice this part I really love. Note, this is the ideology. Okay, Seti the First really wasn't that big. Okay, and his horse really wasn't that big. But this is the picture. This is the ideology that he's the man. He's the conqueror. And as Mario Liverani talks about very eloquently in his book Prestige and Interest, the ideology is that Pharaoh himself goes into battle and single-handedly defeats hundreds of thousands of foreigners and brings them all back captive to Egypt. So this is what he's doing. Now, to come back to Egypt, they have to cross this boundary canal, and they're coming back to the northern Sinai route. Okay, and there's crocodiles in the boundary canal. I just want to show you that this idea of the boundary between Egypt and Sinai as being a watery, liminal point of passage is native to the Egyptian ideology. Outside of that watery boundary is the chaos of the foreigner. Inside is the order of Egypt. This is inverted in the Song of the Sea, which I think there's good reason to think is either the earliest or one of the earliest. Okay, we're going to talk about this later at lunch. Or at least it's a really good poem that depicts using old mythological images. Okay, that's enough for me. Okay? That's enough for me. But it depicts, but it's the sea that separates order from chaos. But in the Song of the Sea, of course, chaos is Egypt, and order is Yahweh, and Yahweh is the single warrior who comes back and defeats the Egyptians, one against hundreds of thousands. I mean, it's, in some ways, it's an inversion of the royal ideology of the Egyptian pharaoh, okay? And it's an inversion in a way that, of course, defeats the pharaoh and humiliates the pharaoh and humiliates his armies and exalts Yahweh. So now Yahweh is the victor, the emblem of order, and Egypt is the emblem of chaos. So I want to just suggest that it's arguable that the Song of the Sea is an inversion of this language of imperial power. And there's even maybe some more specific details that are inversions or mimicry of Egyptian motifs. Okay, the second way of being a slave of Pharaoh in the late Bronze Age period in Canaan is to just live in Canaan. Okay, and again, here I'm talking about the reality and the ideology. So here are some things from the Amarna tablets. Here's the Amarna tablet number 8. This is the Babylonian king writing to the Pharaoh. He says, "Canaan is your country, its kings are your slaves." This is the language of empire. Pharaoh owns this land. The kings are his slaves. The city is his slaves. The land is his land. This is the language that people used. Okay, and the kings, the local kings are bowing down and eating the dirt and falling, and they are the slaves of Pharaoh. They're the Wardu Kittu, the loyal slaves of Pharaoh. Notice the bottom, last line, "May the king, my lord, take cognizance of his slave and his city." Everyone's a slave. Am I done?
No, question. We want to get...
Oh, shit. Okay, let me just finish with this one picture. So here's another El Marta. Amun has put the upper land beneath the feet of the king. This language of empire is also literalized in my favorite pair of shoes, and that is the royal sandals of Pharaoh, which literally has a Canaanite captive on the sole of one foot, a Nubian captive on the sole of the other foot, and he walks around literally walking on these Canaanite and Nubian captives. And these are captives in their own lands, in the land of Canaan, in the land of Nubia, in addition to the foreign. Okay, so all I'm saying here is, in this little model of Nemo history, in the earliest phase of Israelite settlement, which of course we don't have texts from, but it stands to reason that everyone realized that they had been redeemed from the heavy hand of Pharaoh, from the house of bondage. Okay? And so this idea that their God had defeated Pharaoh and that they had been led from slavery to freedom resonates with their actual historical memory. So here is a way that history and ideology and cultural memory all form and crystallize, and that we can, I would argue, this is part of the Nemo history of the Exodus memory. Oh, that's fine. It's only a half hour.
Okay, we want to have some time for questions, so I think...
We've got time for one comment. It's 8:30.
Okay.
Oh, yeah. Okay, so there's arguably tens of thousands of Canaanite slaves in Egypt. It's this slave-based economy. The Canaanite empire ends. The late Bronze Age economic system crumbles. The Egyptian military is no more. There's no more jobs for these foreign slaves. Clearly, the foreign slaves and also, foreign economic immigrants, I assume some of them went home. Maybe most of them went home. The economy wasn't there anymore in Egypt. So I assume that there were Canaanite slaves in Egypt, that after the end of the Egyptian empire, some of them stayed, some of them went home. I think that simply stands to reason.
That's the Exodus group, the small group?
Or lots of small groups. And the Egyptian forts, they weren't being manned anymore. So it's a walk. You got to have a canteen. But it's not that hard anymore. So there are, I think, this is a reconstruction, but it stands to reason, given the data, that some of these foreign slaves must have gone home when it was possible to do so. And this becomes the literal memory of out of Egypt. And what I'm saying is that there's a kind of metaphorical or political memory that we're now out of Egypt in a different way that makes people receptive to that story. Okay, and as for the other one, this is a model, a reconstruction of Nemo history that has, as I said to begin with, lots of gaps in it. But what I want to do is explicate the earliest recoverable textual stuff, and maybe the Song of the Sea or something like that, to show you, from the earliest stuff we do have, can we trace these things back to have linkages with Egyptian ideology or that sort of thing. So that's how I cover that gap.